is within that clade, and everything within this genus is within this clade. So there's consistency between what we're calling a clade and our taxonomic name. And I think they say that here. So A and B are a monophyletic clade, C, D, and E are a monophyletic clade, D and E are a monophyletic clade, and A, B, C, D, and E are also a monophyletic clade. Oops. But for example, A, B, and C don't form a monophyletic clade because they are not grouped together to the exclusion of D and E in terms of their most recent common ancestor. So the most recent common ancestor of A, B, and C is over here, and that also includes D and E, which have that same most recent common ancestor. Going to the next slide, and this is the opposite term is paraphyly, and so this is where taxonomy does not reflect phylogeny, and so these examples are called paraphyly. So paraphyly is where there's a taxonomic group, so a taxonomic name, but everything in that group does not form a clade to the exclusion of everything else. So for example, if A, B, and C were one genus and D and E were a different genus, that would be an example of paraphyly, because A, B, and C are not, do not form a clade to the exclusion of D and E, as I talked about in the previous slide. Now, this is kind of, maybe it's not so easy to understand, because why would you call a taxonomic group, why would you call A, B, and C a taxonomic group and not A, B, and C, D, and E? But the reason is, as I've said, because often we've been misled by looking at morphology, and that doesn't reflect the true relationships. I'll just give you some examples. So here's an example of some organisms that are not fungi, but that you may be familiar with some of them, including up here, humans. And let's take the example of fish. So we've got lobe-finned fish here, we've got ray-finned fish here, and we've got cartilaginous fish here. Now, if we take the ray-finned fish, these form a nice clade. So ray-finned fish are a monophyletic group. They form a nice clade. But if we were to include lobe-finned fish in the fish, and so we were to call fish that includes ray-finned and lobe-finned fish, and maybe also cartilaginous fish, we were to call those a taxonomic group, then their most common recent ancestor, the most common recent ancestor of lobe-finned fish and ray-finned fish, is out here. And that common ancestor also includes all the tetrapods. And so if we were to call lobe-finned fish and ray-finned fish fish, then we would also have to call humans and dogs and mice and birds fish too. So, so fish is an example of a paraphyletic term. If you just include ray-finned fish with the term fish, that's fine. But as soon as you include something like a coelacanth or sharks in fish, then it becomes a paraphyletic term. So that's what's meant by paraphyly. Okay, and so if we go to the next slide, and this is a slide that I showed before, showing the molecular phylogeny of the fungi. And so now we're in a position to interpret this tree. And so what we can find is that the Ascomycota are a nice monophyletic clade, the Basidiomycota are a nice monophyletic clade. The Glomeromycota are a nice monophyletic clade by themselves. But if we go up here, let's imagine that we want to make a clade of the Chytridiomycota. So we have, and let's just consider these three groups as the Chytridiomycota. So if we want to make a monophyletic, if we want to make a clade that has the Chytridiomycota, we need to go back to the most recent common ancestor of all these three groups. So we go back on the tree, go back up, and that is here. So this is the most common recent ancestor of these three groups of Chytridiomycota. But this ancestor also includes everything else. So if we were to make Chytridiomycota as a taxonomic group, it would also include Ascomycota, Basidiomycota, and everything else. And same with the Zygomycota. So the Zygomycota, if we take this group here and this group here, and we take their most common recent ancestor, it's out here, and so that would also include the Ascomycota and the Basidiomycota. And so this is the reason that the true molecular phylogeny of the fungi has all these different groups, because this is a way that we can make monophyletic clades that still keep intact. So we don't have to call everything Chytridiomycota. So if we were to take Zygomycota and Chytridiomycota and try and make a monophyletic clade, then everything would fall in the Chytridiomycota. So this is a way of breaking it up, but it means obviously that the phylogeny of the fungi is much more complicated. Now, the good news is I'm not expecting you to remember all these names. I'm not going to be asking you for these names, so you don't need to know this. You just need to know, if you were given this tree, how to interpret it in terms of monophyly and paraphyly. And so if we go to the next slide, what this means is that both the Chytridiomycota and the Zygomycota, in that original kind of simplified view of the fungi, are both paraphyletic groups, and so they're not good taxonomic names. Okay, and if I go to the final slide, here I'm going to wrap up this section, but what I'm doing in this final slide is just pointing you to some resources that are available on Canvas that go into this tree thinking, in a bit more detail. So there is a paper. So I've taken a screenshot of what it looks like in Canvas. So there's this paper that's indicated here that you can read that talks about tree thinking. And then there's this website here that has some of the terms that you need to know. And once you've read that and come to grips with the material there and what I've talked about, then there's 2 quizzes that I've posted, and you can try both of those quizzes. I don't have the answers up. I'll post those up later. So run through those and see if you can come up with the answers without referring to the answers first. And then I'll put the answers up later so you can check and see how you did. So I strongly recommend to read this and then try these quizzes. And if you can do all this, then you'll understand tree thinking and be able to answer any questions that I present in test or exams on it. So I'll wrap up there, and I'll continue in the next mini lecture to apply this knowledge of tree thinking to sexual and asexual species.